Great. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Kilcrease. I'm going to be your host today. It's about 1 after the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to first thank everyone for joining our webinar today. If you're in the right room, we're in the Strategy Equals Success, a look through experienced eyes for navigating NSF funding proposals webinar. This is put on by the American Ceramic Society and sponsored by Thermo Fisher Scientific. We're going to have 2 wonderful speakers today. So let me tell you a little bit about them before we get started. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Judy Westricht. She's the director of the Lumagen Instruments Center at Wayne State University. And she's going to be presenting to you today her seminar entitled The Actors Needed for a Successful National Science Foundation Major Research Instrumentation Proposal. This is an NSF MRI for some of you that are used to the abbreviations that all of us deal with these days. And then second, we're going to have Dr. Jennifer Carter, who is a faculty director at the Swagelok Center for Surface Analysis of Materials, SAM, at Case Western Reserve University, CWRU. And she's going to be presenting to you today from good idea to finished proposal. Why are there so many steps? Both of our speakers today have an extensive background in academia and have been successful in multiple proposals over the course of their career. And they'll tell you a little bit about their success stories, some of the things they encountered, some of the things to look out for, and how you can be more successful in what you do moving forward with your funding proposals. So today's agenda, we're first going to get into a few housekeeping items, then we'll get into the presentations, and we'll wrap up with a final Q&A. A few housekeeping items that I'll first talk about for you that are attending today. All participants are going to be automatically muted by the administrators of the webinar. And please type any questions that you have into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. There'll be a little Q&A box. You can type your questions in there, and then we will circle back to those during the Q&A session and get to as many as possible. If there are any that we don't get to during the session, we will be sure to follow up afterwards and provide you any information that we can possibly do. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on the ACER's webinar archive page. There will also be a link sent out after the webinar. So if any of your colleagues or if you missed some portions of it, please feel free to circle back and watch the recording. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Judy Westricht. Judy, please take it away.
As I start to share my screen, and are we shared? I just need a nod. Okay, yes. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, today I'm going to be talking to you about how you can write a successful NSF MRI proposal. I referred to actors because unfortunately when they requested me to do this, I was in the first step of thinking about it. And I kept thinking how many people I have to deal with and the actors and the personalities. Because my husband just asked me, like, what are the actors? And it's like, it's everything from OVPR to the people I have to deal with, all the way down to the last quote that I get for an instrument. So as we start this, let me tell you a little bit about myself, and we will go from there. So let me see if I can progress forward. Of course, we are not moving forward. There we go. All right, I'm the director of the Lumagen Instruments Center. I have a lot of different experiences. My first postdoc, I was the first multidisciplinary postdoc at the Institute for Behavioral Genetics, and I was a chemist. And no chemist would cross the line into behavioral genetics and how different it is today. Then from there, I went to a drinking water plant and did drinking water research. And then I basically spent a lot of time at some PUIs. So I went to Northern Kentucky, about 10,000 students, onto Lake Superior State in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's the smallest public university with this whole group of 2,000 students. There, my husband was really excited for us to take team jobs. And our team jobs basically was, hey, look at this beautiful picture you see to the right here of this nice new building. And then you walk into the lab and there are no instruments. So one of our first jobs, my first job was, if I was going to have a laboratory and have research with undergraduates, is I needed instruments. There I was funded with 2 NSF MRIs. The first one, as I tried the first 2 times to get a HPLC with a mass spec and failed, determined that based on how much NSF funding we had, 0, that maybe a PDA would be a little more advantageous and I'd be more apt to be funded. And the answer was yes, I got that through with no problem. And then the next one we did in 2009 was a qPCR. And this qPCR was basically purchased to do environmental research and to integrate it back into chemistry. To give you an indication, we had no NSF funding, but we knew we could get funding from our local and regional public health. So we monitored beaches, we monitored with qPCR, we monitored a lot of community issues such as source tracking and beach monitoring. And from there, I could also develop my area of expertise, which is algal blooms or HABs, harmful algal blooms. Then the most important thing to think about is with the strategic planning of getting this qPCR, Little Lake Superior State got a $2 million grant to basically track COVID. So they were doing wastewater tracking. And so the forefront of thinking about what type of instruments can be used and how they can be developed is really crucial. Coming down now, where am I today? I'm at Lumagen Instrument Center, Wayne State University. My instrument center has 4 facilities. It has a mass spec, it has an NMR and EPR laboratory, electron microscopy, and finally, X-ray diffraction and optical spectroscopy. And you'll notice that I'm not funded yet in a mass spec, even though that's the area I'd like to be in. And I can say that I've submitted a couple. But if you step down, we have gotten an S10 for an NMR, and just recently in the past year. We've got the NSF that I'll be referring to today was a 2020 award, which is for a Talos, a TEM. And then we have a powder X-ray and an XPS that was funded in the last 5 years, actually 7 years. So overview of my talk. What am I going to talk about? Do you need an instrument? I got you in quotes. We'll talk about that more. Read the request for proposal. I highly recommend that you spend some time outlining that and drafting it. We'll talk about that. Selecting a team and an instrument, draft, addressing comments from the draft, the iterative process, and then multitasking, get those other documents done. I've left the other documents to the end, but they really shouldn't be left to the end. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And I'm sure Jennifer's nodding her head. She agrees with that. Don't ever leave those to the end. Creating a story that supports the need for an instrument. Let's talk about that first. How much NSF do you have? How much funding do you really have? You might want to think about that. People don't think about that. They say, oh, I want this big, beautiful instrument. They are going to weigh how much funding you have when you go for that instrument and how much research and how much you can really support that. How many instruments on your area? You want to be unique, very unique. And if you're not unique, you have to justify that you're in so much usage that it's important for you to have one here now. What is acceptable? I think Jennifer has some stories there as far as how far you can go. They considered for us a 45-minute drive, no problem in the middle of a snowstorm. We've had a lot of problems sharing instruments with U of M. We get there and then they're not available. Not a nice thing to do. University of Michigan only being 45 minutes away. And all those did go into the proposal. Needs versus practicality. Everybody wants the high-end instrument with everything on it. That is a flag. You only want to get an instrument with things that you need. And I would argue 95% is getting too high. Aim for 85% of your people's needs and then make sure potentially later you can add it if you want to write another one. Usage fees, the other thing from a practicality perspective, how many of your people actually put usage fees into your instrument? In other words, when they go to use your instrument, do they put the fees in? Because you can't drag money out of something that is there no money is available. And it's something that if you go into no matter what, this is going to be a shared instrument probably. And so you need to think about how you're going to fund that and what's really truly available. And the last one I'm going to state is my experience is buy it, they don't necessarily come. You want to buy something that you already have people there to, and then you want to go forward with that. So that question about you, do you need an instrument? Well, do I personally need an instrument when I was at Lake State? I personally needed an instrument, okay? And then I would go grab everybody and go from there. and say, hey, this is the best instrument ever, especially that qPCR. I really wanted a beach monitor, but I got a group of scientists together and went from there. There's sometimes a group of scientists at hand. So for example, we have a lipidomics center, and that lipidomics center has people that always use the center and say, hey, we want to go to the next level, and then they write. Finally, where I am currently is that shared facility. I have insight that nobody else has. So if you are you and you're looking for insight, come see me, because when you come see me, I can actually tell you potentially who's requested that instrument and how many times they've requested it. I do keep a list. That's my job. I keep a list. Right now, there's 3 people that need solid state NMR. We have no solid state NMR. When I hit 4 or 5, if they're still all interested, that's when we're going to write a grant, and they have funding. The type of instrument is important, what research needs and what can be done with those. Let's be really clear. If you have one, you have an idea of what you can do with one and what new features could potentially do because you're tracking them. If you don't have one, it's a little more difficult. And that we're going to talk about in a second. Your accessories, again, don't go for 100%. One person needs it 1% of the time. You're going to get, that's not going to fly. You're going to need to stay in that area that 85% of the time someone's going to need to use it. Software, we got dinged once because we didn't have an access to software. Nobody wants to sit at the computer, so no one else can use the instrument while you do your workup. How easy is it to purchase modules as you're looking at instruments? Old versus new. If you have an old car and you want a new car, you know how to drive a car. Much easier to convince somebody that you can use that instrument if you have an old one and you want to go to a new one. Much more difficult to say, hey, I want to learn how to drive and I'm going to use your medium to high-end instrument to drive on. Not saying it can't be done, but there's a lot more reasons that it'll be easier to go from old to new. As a matter of fact, for example, I just brought in a broken FTIR microscope in. I will repair it. We will use it for a year. I will show there's usage, and then I will write for one. But if I don't have one and I just have I have no idea. I just know people buy into something that you have and you're going to get something better and that you can already use. I'm not saying a new instrument's impossible, because if you have an expert, you have an expert. They're ready to go. Submissions. I'm going to hit this lightly because I know Jennifer is going to hit this too. We have track 1 and track 2. This is a limited submission. This is easy for a PUI because PUIs typically don't have more than 1 or 2 going in. All right. But you only can put 2 track 1, which is under $1 million, and you can only put 1 track 2. And what I find at my university, a lot of people want to submit track 1s and only 1 or 2 want to submit track 2s. And of those, they're usually computer-based because I would consider ourselves not a big enough university with that type of expertise to bring the highest instrument in so far. So when you're at a large university, I got caught into this. When we started, there was no. You just went and you did it because not enough people were doing this. By year 3, we had a competition that I didn't know about. I submitted and then I wasn't selected and I wrote a proposal. And then they said, well, they better do it differently. So here are the things. Be aware of your timeline. We'll talk about timelines. Be aware of who's going to decide, how they're going to decide, what type of criteria do they have. What you're going to need to do to put in is you're probably going to need 2 to 3 pages, a short description of the project. You're going to have basically a bio sketch from your people. You're going to have operation management previews and even be able to figure out where the money's coming from for that 30% match. So what is your timeline? I start in a year in advance. I start looking for my actors. Who can do this? Who may be able to use this instrument and not even know. I basically go to the NSF awards search site down there and I pull out people that have NSF grants and I read their little description and say, can they use something that I'm looking for? I ask each of those people that I convinced to write 1 paragraph and I start with that 1 paragraph and line that up. Based on that 1 paragraph, I start selecting instruments. I don't select the instruments until I have a committee together. But more importantly is if you look at the next set and coming down, you're going to have to start collecting data on the new types of instrument you're looking at. And collecting data is important because people like to see it. And we started with submitting without that. And by the last one for the SEMs, DMs, we always had pictures. And we'll talk more about that. Timeline for this is crazy. So I started 1/2023 for my new instrument. Then I write an NOI, a notice of intent, and I do my 3-4 pages. And then at the end of August, they tell me, yes, you can go ahead and write a full proposal for August or for October 31st. Give your full proposal, turn it in, and give a PowerPoint presentation, and then they'll have an internal review. The biggest difficulty here is the full proposal. It's a hard commitment to convince 5 people, yourself, and a bunch of other people that you're going to do a full proposal and not be able to submit it. So we've ran into that difficulties more than once here. How to select your team. I just real quickly, NSF funding, other funding, and diversity. Those are to me, the 3 criteria that we have. What type of NSF funding, how much money you have. Other, they're interested, where's that piggy bank going to come from, and diversity. As a matter of fact, in their statement, they say, encourages proposals with early career PIs. Proposals will benefit early career researchers. Hence, you probably would want one of those if you can find one. So, replacing our obsolete transmission like microscope, our TEM, with a brand new one. 5th try was a charm. And the first 2 times we submitted, no good. We got our comments, we commented, we reviewed, we went back over it. The 3rd time we went to submit, we got denied a spot. And then in my mind, that's the worst thing that happens. You start over. So your project director might not be the same project officer. It's really important to try to convince your team that you want to be in the same spot. You want to keep going until you're funded. Clearly, how did we start this? In the first paragraph, I always have a quick acknowledgement to what our usage is and why it's important that we have a TEM. But then more importantly, I always state the 5 or 6 things that make this instrument unique. And they're very clear. And it's almost like a list. You basically say the advantages to this new instrument we're proposing is fast and precise EDS mapping, Z contracting, large field, high field camera, nano beam diffraction. I use that as a list throughout my proposal. Okay, going back to this idea. What level entry? If you're going to go to a more advanced and higher than entry level, we got what I call a more advanced microscope, because we have a manager, but our manager, I wouldn't say, is a TEM expert of the experts. On top of that, U of M has the highest end, and NSF funded that. So we don't want to be just like the guy next door to us that's only 45 miles away. Again, the 2 out of 5 rule, use that. And then also remember the software. Don't forget that. So this is after we get those 5 bullets or 6 bullets, we want to quickly tell them how many people we have that are going to use this instrument and where they're located, who they are. So we have a researcher, we have a name, we have the institute, are they at Wayne State? And then what department they're in. You'll see Chem E, you'll see physics, you see biomed E. And then we have what type of research they're doing in a quick description, the PI, co-PI, and of course you can see in there all of our early career people that are going to benefit from this. Then finally, we list all of the current funding they have. And if you've noticed that most of my PIs and co-PIs, except for the early career award, have at least 2 NSF grants. This is a $1.4 million grant. I would argue this is the top end. We basically took our 9999, divided out, and said that's what we're going to put in. So this is important. Diversity, 2 men, 2 women. And you can see I had plenty of people to choose from, but that's the path we took. When we were writing it, we were very specific. We stuck with one thing. This is a material science instrument. And then we broke it into categories. And all of our 23 people had to fit into one of these categories, or we needed another category. So then we started with energy conversion storage. And then we would put a little blurb about how important this is, and then how each person has their little area from that paragraph. And then the co-PIs would get their time and light and glory. And that I received from them 3/4 of a page to a full page, including the images. What did we do for images? Perfect example. It took us the 3rd try to do this, and we got it right the 3rd time. On the left-hand side, this is the Brock group. On the left-hand side, you have our current TEM labeled A. And then if you go to the middle, you have our new, what would be our proposed TEM image. And then you take it a step further and you can say this can go down and we can see the nanoparticles. outlined here. And then she was very specific how this would help her transform her product into a different product, and now what she understands. Also here you see that using this TEM, we can do a nanoparticle and we can basically scan across that and tell you where your elements are. Going from left to right, what you'll notice in the middle is we have a big arsenic blue core. This was new for them. And again, she took her time. She explained why this was important and something she'd been waiting for. Meanwhile, they're publishing from all these pictures too, which helped. So all these images went into publications and helped to get to the next step. This is then from our micro electronics and our sensing section. This was Robert Fetty's work. He has a bunch of crystalline powder and he brings it through several temperature changes. And then he'll take a specific crystalline and he can see the pattern. He can see that it came back through all the different environmental changes he made. And then he could take the STEM and scan and basically see where the fluorides are and the cations are. These are four images. Ours had 8 images and they were all done on a Talos because that's really where we wanted to be focused on based on everything we saw. Boring time, we're going to zip through this, but it's important. Results from prior NSF, PI and co-PI. You see my little diagram there because what you have is what you get. The most important thing is the first one is any of your co-PIs, you need to make sure your co-PIs are publishing, they're turning in the reports and they're successful. If your co-PI isn't doing that, you might want to select another one and move them into minor users category, even if they're a major user. They want to see success. And if they're using an MRI and that MRI is in the center, use the director to get the information you need. The director can summarize they're keeping track of all these things. They're keeping track of publications. They're keeping track of things, at least on our end we do. And then finally, they're going to have to talk about some research. So again, they need successful research and they need to be publishing and things need to be going out. So then I call it the boring part of the grant, description of the research instrument and needs. How do we approach this? Okay, we basically took each of those features and said, okay, this is the feature we need and this is what gives it to us. And then we said current, beam, probe, current. So basically described what that was and what it gave us. Then the next thing is why it's important. This is important. And then finally compared it to the old instrument. And it was the comparison to the old instrument that came into the last proposal that I think pushed us over. That we could clearly state all we're doing is showing that we can use this instrument and we understand what it does. We went back and reviewed. It's like, okay, let's look at old instruments and let's look at proposed. A left-hand side are old, proposed. We re-summarized that for them one more time in the section. And then we went to the next section and basically said, who's in the area and why doesn't this work? And basically, for how many hours we were using our electron microscope and how many hours people were on the road because our old one wasn't meeting the purpose, we could clearly show that it needed to come in-house. Our broader impacts. To the left is Stephanie Brock. She actually was the PI on this. I was the ghost writer and she did all the smoothing out. But understand where your broader impacts are. Understand what you do institutionally, what you do regionally, and how that can be folded in. Wayne State is in the middle of Detroit. We're an urban campus. We have lots of diversity. We make sure we mention that undergraduates are using the instruments. We also talk about training, education, and community outreach. Each one of my PIs had to write something about their outreach so we can include it in. And then finally, when we get down to PUIs, every one of my center has 2 or 3 PUIs using it regularly. And we can incorporate that in. And how we reduce costs for them, we make it work for them. Courses down here, impact on courses, please list your course and how you're going to use it. NSF cares. NIH might not, but NSF does. Okay, so that's kind of the difference there. And finally, economic impact. Again, industry tends to use our facilities. Finally, we're into management plan, and there's Mike on the far right-hand corner. He's responsible for that. We described where the instrument goes easily. It's in the basement of chemistry, middle of campus. We do have a safety section. It's only 5 sentences, but I highly recommend having a safety section. I think it's important. I think it's where we are today. Training, the different types of training, maintenance plan, how we're going to get it fixed. Thank God we can always say all of our instruments get fixed somehow, and the description of how you're going to allocate time. That was our hardest thing because we don't usually have that problem. There's usually enough spots for everybody to fill in. So we had to come up with something there. And how we're going to attract new supporters and is basically word of mouth, but we do go to a couple local conferences and make sure we have things there. Here's that final set of documents: budget, justification. A budget is easy. You just list everything that's on your quote. Justification, we literally went through like every one of those accessories and gave the reason and who's going to use it. Facilities and equipment, that just tells it's the standard data management. We always mention that all the PIs have their own data management program, but we also, as a core, we have backup on everything, 2 or 3 backups on everything. You remember to get your current and pending and your collaborators, and I highly recommend sending them the links to the newest forms of it so they can put it in, because I always get one that's 2 or 3 years old and then I have to retype it. And then finally, the university's letters of commitment. There's 3 of them, and there's 2 of them if you're a PUI. The first university I was at, Lake State, we did not know where to get any of these documents. And it took us 3 whole days working on who to sign and what to do. So I highly recommend knowing who's going to sign which document and where you're getting it from, and line that up early. On that, I'm going to leave it to Jennifer, and I'm going to try to get off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Judy. That was a great
So now that you see
presentation.
all my screens, stop sharing, and this is on to Jennifer.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Jennifer Carter. Go ahead and take it away, Jennifer. You're on mute.
There we go. Now you can hear me. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the United States. I'm assuming everybody on the call is from the United States, because that would be who would be applying to NSF proposals. And so today, just kind of want to talk about the steps of it all. I will start with my own MRI story. I have slightly less MRI, less MRI experience than our first speaker. But I have participated as a science participant or collaborator, as minor collaborator, as our past speaker talked about, on several occasions. Most of these were unsuccessful, and I think that's sort of the primary takeaway from this, is that you got to kiss a lot of frogs to make it work. Then very recently, I was a key participant in a one successful one for a new computing cluster. This was a new faculty that had gotten hired, and he wanted to upgrade our university's high performance computing clusters. And so he was successful with that new instrument case that Judy talked about. But of course, this was a new hire that could lead that forward, and it was helpful. So I've been a primary writer twice. Once, the first time I submitted it is a story and is probably inappropriate for a recorded live audience here, but I was successful with my first attempt in 2020, where I got to purchase a Thermo Fisher Aprio. And then last season, I was unsuccessful. In this case, I wrote it as a ghostwriter, and there were other PIs on the tool. The advantage, of course, of this is that this was for a tool that we needed for the facility that I now run as the faculty director. And I guess I didn't really introduce myself. So I'm an associate professor in the material science and engineering department. And be careful what you wish for. After getting the MRI in 2020, I became the faculty director of our microscopy facility. And that led me to starting to ghostwrite for other equipment that because I am the facility director, I know the current state of our equipment and what needs to be replaced next. And so convincing faculty to trust me and let me use their names is a fun problem. But it's an interesting thing to note that, of course, every MRI proposal starts with who you have at your university. I honestly would say that I wouldn't have been successful if I hadn't had a colleague that was like, oh yeah, I had an MRI funded, and I asked them for their proposal to see how it was all set up. And the information that Judy provided on the last slide is right aligned with the advice that I was given, and we move forward with that. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time mostly talking about how to set up that team and what are all the steps and things that you should probably consider as you move forward for that. So of course, the first thing that happens is that we start with the internal proposal, right? As Judy indicated, that it can take years for you a year or more to figure out what you need and what you want. In the case of the Aprio, I thought I had a good idea. I had been, kicking it around informally for a while, and said on a lark in a mentor meeting, hey, yeah, on my list of things to do this September is to submit an MRI if I have time. The internal deadline is, middle of November. And my colleague was like, no, it's the middle of October. And I was like, oh, well, then I guess that's not going to happen because that's in 2 weeks. And I don't know what I'm doing. And, they asked about my idea, and I was like, this is the instrument. This is why I think I need it, or we need it here. And this is what I think it'll do. And he was like, well, you've convinced me. So I think you should try really hard to figure out how to submit it. And I was like, fine, there goes my Christmas break. And so I ended up doing that. So it was a good thing that my university policies on limited submission are pretty easy. It's not a heavy lift to do, but that may or may not be the case in your institution. At my institution, the internal submission is a 2-page proposal plus the CVs of the PIs. And then, of course, the cost share letter that the dean's office provides for what you need. And that 30% cost share can be hard to come by, depending on how your university funds things. So the next thing that has helped me, and I didn't really know this going in, and I probably should have, is to understand who at your university are competitors for limited submission slots and who might be collaborators. At our institution, the big 3 that submit fairly regularly are the medical school, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the physics chemistry departments. And then, of course, the College of Engineering, where I'm located. And so that's already 3 potential locations. But then, of course, there's the individual departments and the individual faculty. And so who do you need, right? And so this gets into like who uses the equipment and who might use the equipment if you have something new. And so a case, of course, we have the obvious players for microscopy would be physics, geology, any and all of the engineering departments. But what's been really fun is to learn about the more interesting and unexpected users in art conservation and archaeology are 2 that have come up that I never would have thought of when we originally started working with this, but in our collaboration since have been really fun and exciting to work with. So those were things to consider. And then the thing to consider is who at your institution is allowed to submit as PI. And does the PI match with who's running the instrument, if you have to run the instrument in a core facility or not? So my institution, only tenured track or tenured faculty can write core proposals for NSF or federal grants, which means that the core directors, the core facility directors, who are all not tenured track faculty, cannot be PIs. And so they're sort of hamstringed in their ability to lead some of these things. And so that is something to consider moving forward, is you very much need those people's help to convince anyone that the equipment would get used and maintained and all of those things, but they may not have the authority to be able to write them themselves. So at CASE, they've newly stated in the last couple of years that any instrument, any track 1 instrument, so purchase, has to go into a core facility and has to be available for everybody on campus. And so that core facility may or may not be the PI that's writing the grant, right? So in the last one that we just submitted, I was the core facility director, but I was not the PI of the grant because I didn't need the XRD for any of my research, but the PIs did. And as the core facility director, I knew that that was the thing that we needed to be replacing because the instruments we have were 20 years old and it was just a matter of time, right? And so all of this to say is that the organizational chart and what yours looks like kind of has an impact on where you find these players and who do you have to get involved and where the decision may be made on who gets to say yes or no in the internal review. Right, the PI can only be the faculty, but then the instruments have to go in a shared core facility, and that may or may not be integrated with the rest of the institution in like a logical organizational flow. And so you learn a lot about how your university works or doesn't work with regard to funding equipment and maintaining facilities by doing this type of proposal. So the internal proposals go from all of the schools go to our vice president of research. And then they decide if there are multiple proposals from the same college. Sometimes they will decide which of those 2 instruments or 3 instruments they're going to let go forward. And sometimes they kick the can back to the deans of the respective colleges. This surprised me the first time around because I ended up getting listed without my knowledge as co-PI on a second MRI the year I submitted my first one. And the College of the VPR's office kicked it back to the dean's office. And then the dean's office kicked it back to me because they're like, you're listed as PI on both of these. So which one do you want more? And I was like, that's a surprise. But okay. And so that's kind of a fun thing. Core facilities are really useful. There's this idea of, what do they do, right? These are places that we have equipment and provide training and service and expertise because, as Judy said, maintaining and using and the application of a car today is very different than a car in the 60s, right? I can take apart my Volkswagen and put it all back together in my garage if I have the space. But maintaining my Toyota Sienna is very different. And so the core facilities are a solution to that. And so even with all the faculty and their different needs, there are a variety of cores. The CASE alphabet soup for this, in just the materials specific cores, right? We have a whole bunch of them, right? And so any one of these core facilities in the College of Engineering, in fact, 2 of those are not in the College of Engineering, but either way, any one of these cores at any given year may or may not want to purchase an instrument and move forward. And so you could have lots of competition. So this is my particular center. We mostly have focused on spectroscopy, but it can move forward and shift and change with our users. So It would be bereft of me if I didn't highlight the cool equipment that we have as selfish. So we have, who can submit, what are the departments, who's allowed, right? And the next question is like, well, what's the strategic plan for your leadership? And does the instrument match that and those goals? Because your department or your university or your college may have different strategic goals than different department or even NSF. And so even though NSF cares about one set of criteria, your college may have a different one. And so balancing those things and making sure that they match is the case, right? So in the Case School of Engineering, we have 8 different strategic thrusts. So if I'm going to try to propose an instrument for internal review, probably should hit several of these if I want to try to be competitive, right? That is assuming that there's enough to warrant a competition, right? If it happens to be one of these years where nobody submits, it doesn't matter. So all of this is to say that the landscape of your university can dictate whether or not something gets out of limited submission. I hope for your case that it's not having to submit a full proposal like Judy, because that's a horrible idea. We would never get anything written. But it can, separate out what do you have. And so some years there's lots of stakeholders that compete, and some years there's nobody that wants to submit, because part of the problem with having a fairly low bar for a limited submission is that you're going to do a whole lot of this after that's been considered. So sometimes people don't want to submit because they don't really want to lose their Christmas break, right? There are just years where I'm like, I would like to actually have a break. And so I don't want to submit, right? This was one of those years that I didn't want to submit, and I'm going to end up submitting anyways, because having listened to the many stakeholders, there's nobody else submitting this year for internal review. So I could just go ahead and submit and we could just move on, right? But it's important to know that, getting the proposal through the internal review may or may not align with NSF's mission. And so you may have to change that as you go. So that is to say that for the internal submissions at my university, we found that the build proposals or track 2 are less competed than track 1. And so our university and NSF seems to allow those to be a more specialized type of equipment than the purchased one. It seems that the last couple of years that the broader the impact and the broader the user base, the more more impactful NSF has found with the proposal. But and so how do you get the right instrument, right? Judy said she starts a year in advance. And really it's just talking to people. It's so many emails and so many meetings and so many samples, because you want to send samples because it's an instrument you don't have. And so I don't even know if you're going to be able to get the data that you need, right? Or I have users that are like, oh, if I had this, maybe it would be useful, but because I don't have it now, I don't know. And so you end up shipping samples back and all of these things. And so it's listening to what people need and repeating back to them what they told you, and then doing it all again when you realize that you likely can't buy it sole source and you now have to have 3 vendors instead of 1. And so it's a lot of just organizational time. But it's fun if you like to talk to people. So that's fine. So a note on where to find the 30% cost share. 30% cost share is a fairly high bar for this, because you can't use tuition or salary support for graduate students or faculty for a track 1 proposal. You can only do that for a track 2 proposal where you're building the instrument. And so you don't have a whole lot of non-capital cost share options for this. There's effectively one. And so the rest of it is just, where do you come up with that capital? And sometimes this is an easy thing to find out, and sometimes this is a hard thing to find out. Talk to your grants admin staff. They're going to know about things that you just don't know. So for many years, the Ohio Board of Regents of Education would match funds, match capital cost share dollar for dollar for MRI proposals. But every year we submit the proposal, we have to go dig through their website, which changes every 18 months to figure out where it is. And we're not even sure it's going to be there next year. And so, I don't know. So that might be something that's an option in your own states. And then you may also have local industry that may want to participate. We've had some success in the past with industrial clients providing capital cost share with the idea that if we are able to get a part, an accessory or something that would particularly inspire them to come use the cost center, that we would effectively comp them the time for a percentage of that cost share. And so we work through that, and it's very interesting. So they don't have to pay for it twice within the MRI program. And it is interesting to note that the way the university interprets the rules can kind of change from year to year. I went back and looked, and in 2020, my university had one way of dealing with adding the service contracts in years 2 and 3 of the program. And then when I tried to resubmit in 2022, they would not let me do that same thing. They were like, nope, not allowed to do that. We figured out that was not a way to do it, and nope. And so in this way, we worked with the supplier, the vendor, and they effectively just built the service contract into the cost of the microscope and changed the line item that says this includes a 1-year service contract to say this includes a 3-year service contract. And so then it was built into the cost of the microscope, and so you paid it in this first year, and so it ended up being that was another way to deal with it. So, but that seems to be inconsistent from 1 year to the next. It can be inconsistent from one college to the next. So that same year I was talking with a group that was trying to put one in for a MALDI-TOF. Not really sure what that is, but they wanted to put one in the chemistry department, and their grants admin team were telling them to do something completely different. And so the woman that was PI for that was like, how are you dealing with this? Because I'm at an impasse and I don't know what to do. And so talk to other people, figure out what they've done, and see what might be able to work. So, and then finally, just stay organized with all of the other documents. There are so many other documents. Create a checklist. Who do you need CVs from? Who do you need letters of commitment from? How you need a letter of collaboration, and you need a science contributor for each person that you have a letter of collaboration. And one of the things that has saved me a bunch of time that nobody else had done when I was a science participant and has just been super helpful is that I made a template and was like, I want the information you give me in this format. And I want the title, I want your name, what is the project, what's the goals, and just separated them out. The thing that I have added to this in the last year is this currently funded by something? And I don't, whether it's just to say, look, this isn't a new idea, this is something that this would benefit something that's already funded. And so how to keep track of all of that. And so with that, I will end my talk, and I think we will open it up to the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you again, Judy. You both gave great presentations. So now, as both of you mentioned, we will open it up for a Q&A session. And please remember to use the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. And we should see some questions coming in shortly. Maybe I can kind of kick it off with. And I think this is probably a good one for Jennifer. So let's say you're new to a university. How do you find out some of the points you mentioned, such as the internal consideration for review process, as well as the competitors to your submission? Those seem to be very important factors. So if you're just coming into a university and you're maybe writing your first grant, what's a good way to kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak. The faculty member that wrote the proposal for the performance computing cluster, they had started at the university, and in their startup, they were given a certain amount of capital, but not nearly enough to purchase the computing cluster that they needed to purchase. And so right off the bat, he needed to get in and write this MRI. And he's like, I have never written one of these, and you were successful last year. What do I need to know? And so probably the best thing to do is to see if anybody's in your institution has successfully gotten one in the last couple of years, and go talk. And barring that, because I don't think we had a successful one at our university in the College of Engineering for 5 or 6 years before I got mine. So it had been a while. And so I just went to talk to the grants person in the dean's office, because they had a higher level understanding of the cost share than my department research admin team had. And I needed that right away. And so getting support from your dean's office or your, provost of research or whoever is responsible for that is key in figuring out that right away.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you for that. Let's see, we got another one here for Jennifer. I'll read it out. It says, I really like Jennifer's suggestion of a template for contributions to the proposal. I am writing one MRI right now, and the quality of what I'm getting from the individual researchers is quite different. How prescriptive is your template? I realize that it's just saying, please use EndNote does not seem to reach more than 60% of contributors.
Yeah, Anna, thanks for your question. So I will almost always give my template to my PIs first, right? They are the foundation by which everything else matches. And so I use theirs as an example of what I want other people to do. And then I cull the information down. The just use EndNote, I have found that there is a huge disparity between faculty that hand type their references and people that don't, and there's everything in between. And so one of the things that I always ask for is the DOI, is instead of is to give me the reference, and in the comments, I send them an example of where I have commented the reference and put the DOI or the full reference link, and then I find it and I ingest it into EndNote or Zotero or whichever one you're using. But when I ask for the science input, not only do I provide them an example, but I also provide them effectively that bulleted list that Judy that said she puts in the front of her proposal of these are the main things that this thing will do. And I tell them, you have been put into this group, and so I need you to address how you will use this accessory, right? And so I will remind them which ones they're supposed to be highlighting, and if they don't give me what I need, I go back to them and I ask. And so it ends up being this iterative process of what do you mean here? This was, you're using acronyms I don't understand. So asking that question and working through. And some people are really responsive and some aren't. And I tend to start with more contributors than I think I can fit, because some of them are just not going to respond. And then I still have enough to put together the story.
Great suggestions. There's one sort of along those lines. Maybe we can, and sort of a segue from that, the last comment, I think we can throw over to Judy maybe. And it's, how would you navigate the capabilities requested or needed by different groups when everybody wants their request to be number one?
I start with my rule of thumb, and I tell them right out, odds are this instrument isn't going to be able to do 100% of what you want it to do unless everybody else wants that 100%. And that of my 5 PIs or a lot of minor users, I'm going to have to add up to say to justify that $100,000 extra, because people are counting those $100,000 when you submit as much as I have. They look. And so that checkbox is very important. But we also, oftentimes I'll say, okay, so if you can do 95% of your stuff here, where do you do the extra 5%? And where is it going to go? And we will put that in the proposal, because then in the future, you can reference that as an add-on. Because that's the other thing that people don't realize, that in 2 years, if you're successful and your instrument's getting used, you could successfully write a $200,000, $300,000 add-on to your instrument. So for example, the TEM that I talked about the full time, we're going to be adding a cryo stage to it, and we're probably going to end up going to NIH, not NSF this time. But it's a 100,000 plus add-on. And well, by the time you add that on all the other things you want, like the programs and stuff. So it's you have to think of parts too, and then start weighing those parts. But just be upfront with everybody. Ideally, in an ideal world, we'd like to fund everything. And sometimes my XPS funded everything everybody wanted, and then some more. Thank you, Thermo Fisher, for that one. But our XPS, we had I'm trying to think which one. Can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's a phenomenal instrument, and it does everything everybody wanted and was within the budget. So, but for the TEM, it was not. People wanted eels, people wanted other things that we just said, hey, you're the only one that needs eels, and you're only going to use it maybe 3 times a year. That's not going to cut it. So it's unfortunate. Nobody withdrew. Nobody said, I don't want to be part of it, when I told them they couldn't do the 3%, that they'd have to go to U of M for that. So that was the good news.
You got to be the gatekeeper to prioritize.
Yes. You let them know you're going to prioritize, and they have something to say in that, but it'll be a group, not just you.
Of course. Well, I think we have time for one more quick question. We got about 1.5 minutes left. The comment is, great talks today. Thanks for sharing your experiences. Do either of you know how cost sharing will work for NSF MRI submissions in 2023 and let's say and beyond? Any insights into that?
They are listed on the website. I have reviewed them, but I don't remember them off the top of my head. So I don't know that. I don't know that if my interpretation are going to be all that helpful for you. I think you want to look at how your institution is going to interpret those. But I think they state that you can only do capital cost share, no facilities upgrades. You can't, upgrade the plumbing or replace the doors because it won't fit. None of that counts as cost share. And you can only, on the track 1 proposals, you can only cost share technical staff support that are directly responsible for maintaining the instrument or training users. The rules for the track 2 are a little bit different. And I think the way they want it this year in the budget is that all of the cost share has to be allocated in the first year, but then doesn't have to be paid out until the end of the project. So if you ended up with a 3-year project, you could pay it out later, but the way they want to see it in the budget is a little bit different than how it can be paid out. And that is a little bit different this year than last year. And I think that's in the vein of service contracts and adding them or not.
Wonderful. Very helpful. Well, let's thank Jennifer and Judy again for some wonderful talks today, great information and lots of insight. To all the attendees, if you have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the society. They can pipe it to the appropriate people as well. And thank you, a big thank you to the American Ceramic Society as well for hosting this webinar today, and to one of our corporate partners, Thermo Fisher Scientific. With that, we'll thank all of our attendees as well for your time, and please keep an eye out for future webinars along these lines. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.